All right, guys, bang, bang. I have a very special treat for you today. Cliff is here, and he's one of the rare people who comes on, and he's done the work. He's run a real business, scaled it, been super successful. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk.
Great. Good to be with you today, Anthony. Appreciate the opportunity.
For sure. Let's just start with your background. You grew up where, got into law, and eventually ended up at Sonic, but kind of tell us the story of how you get to the business.
So, grew up in North Texas until finished elementary school. Adolescent years was spent in Oklahoma City. Kind of a pivotal point that really formative in my life. My family moved from Wichita Falls to Oklahoma City after my dad lost his business due to a variety of circumstances. But he lost the business. He lost everything. And I was 11 going on 12. And to see that in my family literally lose our home, and that was impactful for all my life, And I remember when my youngest kid was 11 years old, and I told him, when I was your age, we were evicted from our home. And my kid just couldn't believe it, just couldn't fathom the concept, So anyway, he took a sales job in Oklahoma City. He was better off being at the intersection of I-40 and Interstate 35. So we moved to Oklahoma City, and within 2 or 3 years, he was back in business for himself. He was really a serial entrepreneur, and very impressive the way he recovered. But at any rate, so on the plains, North Texas, Oklahoma, here through undergraduate school, went east for 5 years, was in Washington, D.C., took a law degree at Georgetown University, lived in Baltimore, Maryland for a couple of years, practiced law while my wife was in graduate school there. Then we returned to the plains. My big idea, just because the economy was so hot, and what I didn't realize, it was overheated by a oil boom that was debt fueled. And so within a year after our moving back, all that came unwound. I spent a couple of years in a business law practice here, but I saw that going down because the economy is going down. So my view was I either had the opportunity to try to get inside a company that wasn't tied to the oil business, or frankly, leave the region. And at this point, I was late 20s. My wife was still in graduate school. She'd continue on with her studies. She's an epidemiologist and eventually became a PhD in epidemiology. But I decided I need to kind of stay here and help support her get through that process. So I left private law practice, went to Sonic. I was 29 years old. So here I was, amazingly enough, 29 years old and general counsel of a public company called Sonic. How I got into business, our company went through 2 LBOs. They talk about that in the book. Went through 2 LBOs in the late 80s. Took it public in the early 90s. I was central to all of those in terms of helping orchestrate them. And then after we went public, I decided I was going to leave the company, told the CEO, and this is a compressed version of the story, but once I told him I was going to leave, he said, well, why don't you stay here and run the company? And so I became COO, and it was a gradual process in terms of learning about the company. From the time I joined the company until I became COO, it was like 9 years, so it's not like it happened overnight. But I'd had an opportunity to really learn the business, and so that's how I got onto the business side. And a year and a half, I'd say, after I became COO, I was running the company day to day. My boss left, and rather suddenly, but he left the company, and the board turned to me and said, "You want to be CEO?" And I thought, well, I'm already running the company, so why not? And same day they named me CEO, and I was CEO for the next 23 years.
So when you come in as the general counsel and you eventually become the CEO, those are 2 very different functions.
Yeah.
But you're doing it at a time when there's multiple transactions going on, the company's growing. Talk through a little bit just as to, in hindsight, what were the key pieces either of learning or people that helped you transition from that general counsel role into eventually the CEO role, and then kind of set you up for success to thrive as the CEO of Sonic?
Great. Yep. So, one, I got to say, I think one of the biggest factors was I was young. And because of that, when I joined Sonic, I'd been practicing law 4 years. If I'd been practicing law 20 years, might not have been malleable enough to move over to the business side. But I was 29, and it was this relatively small company, and I was aggressive and curious and always pushing out, So the team was light from a management, quantity and quality of management. And so it really meant that I was often able to fill a void on special projects and so on. But it also meant that when he wanted to buy the company, a CFO might have stepped in, but we didn't have a CFO technically. And this meant that I really just got to learn the business. My boss wanted to buy the company, and he wanted to do that from the outset, but that was hard to pull off. But I think part of his thought in hiring me with a business background and maybe expectations beyond an ordinary lawyer from the standpoint of just life expectations. I don't know. Anyway, he saw in me somebody who could help him do that. So the process is, to a great degree, I joined the company in 84 and 86. We did buy the company. And to do that, to structure that and sell it to lenders and so on and so forth, it really did take more understanding of how we made money, didn't make money, how we could change that going forward. And because the company was hit a bit of a low point when he joined the company and I joined the company. But we were able to buy it in, I got invested, as a stockholder. So yeah, but that gave me a little bit different view of things. Within 2 years, we had a lot of motivation, contractual motivation, to buy out our institutional partner that had joined us in 86. And 3 years into the deal, the price was going to go up. And besides that, they wanted out. They needed to show a return to their investors. So 2 years into having bought the company, we restructured the ownership, and I was able to pull out a lot of my investment. Able to pull out a severe multiple of what I'd put in 2 years before. And, suddenly this gets your attention, because in that 88 recap, just to give you, and I talk about this in the book, it was all public too. But I in cash out of pocket in 86, I put out in $2,500. And 2 years later, I pulled out over $600,000. And so one was the leverage with a leverage buyout, and two was the turnaround that started occurring, and the value of the company was exploding. So suddenly here I am, early 30s. Now I've got a kid. My wife and I had our first son. We're both 30. And so now I'm a larger part of a company, larger ownership. I went from 1% ownership to 8% ownership, and had pulled out this capital, which, here on the plains during an oil bust, watching bankruptcies all around me, that was an extraordinary thing in my life. So it gave me a little bit more motivation to come to understand this thing. And a couple of years into it, our new institutional partners wanted to take it public for their own purposes. They wanted to liquefy. So they turned to me. They said, advise the team on how to go public. So I took a central role in that for the next year and more. And we were successful in taking it public. So once again, 2 LBOs, an IPO, dealing with all aspects of this, but particularly from a corporate finance standpoint. I didn't have a finance background, but I'd gotten extraordinary on-job training, you would say. So this was my introduction to the business, and thinking more like business, how to strategizing about growth of the business. What would I do with the team, meaning the management team? If they were my management team, who would go, who would grow, so on and so forth. So this was this kind of 7 or 8 years after I joined the company. It actually was I short-circuited stuff earlier. It was in 92 that my boss came to me and said, you've been general counsel for 8 years. How would you like to be CFO? And it was pre Sarbanes-Oxley, and I kind of thought, fine, I'd learn more doing this. Had good team in place and a good auditors and so on, good board. So I said yes to that. And then it was a year later when I said, okay, I'm going to leave. And he said, no, become COO and just run the company. So it was a gradual process, but a very real one of personal and professional development for me before I was made CEO.
Yeah, it's a fantastic story. While you were running the business, both as COO and then eventually CEO, the business had pretty explosive growth. It went from just over 1,000 stores, I think, to over 4,000 locations. Drive-in sales, up double digits, year over year, and just by all measures, a very successful oversight of the business and the growth that it enjoyed. What was the secret to success? Was it improving the product? Was it better marketing? Was it investing in the brand? Was it just simply hiring great people? Like when you look back and you say, we had this, epic run of success, here is the playbook. What do you say?
Well, in a way, all those things you just listed, the answer is yes, yes, yes. Yeah. So a series of things that came together just as I became CEO. And then, the question is, what do you do with them? But we drove them like crazy. So what were two of the things that came together? Okay, I should say three, but they played in a huge way. The first was while I was COO, I conducted over a 13-month period, I conducted a license renegotiation with our franchisees, with our franchise leadership, because the licenses were coming to closure in the late 90s. And our franchise leadership, and us, but really our franchise leadership was very concerned about that because they did not want to get to the end of the license agreement. And then, all of them have scores of stores that, could lose their licenses. So they wanted years in advance to renegotiate this. And we were willing to, because we built the value of the brand. So this was 93, 94. And I just moved into the COO role, literally, as that began. And so 13-month process, the franchisees felt like it was painful. I felt like it was enormously successful because they got what they wanted and we got what we wanted. They wanted elongated terms, and they wanted more protected trade radius around their stores, meaning a little enlarged. It was 1 mile, and they wanted it larger in different circumstances and so on. So those are their two big points in negotiation: longer term, better protection, trade radius around the store. We wanted more authority as a franchisor, a modern franchisor, which we didn't have, and authority to require, single agency for advertising, authority to require buying off of a single contract for goods across the system, authority to require every few years a trade dress upgrade at the store level. So we got all these things in there. Plus, we got a modern royalty rate, which had been quite outdated as well. So that was one thing. Simultaneously with that, we were leading them through a process to talk about where does this brand need to go, and the two fit together perfectly because the license agreement gave us the authority. In a way, it's this difference in authority of de jure versus de facto. De jure being the law, de facto being, building credibility, street cred with folks, And so the authority we were building, it really in a way had both of those, because the new license agreement was the de jure. The new license agreement was the law that we had, but a process that we were taking the whole system through, meetings to talk about facilities and uniforms and menu inconsistencies and so on, was the street cred piece. So that by the time we reached the finish point on this street cred piece, we had a new menu, we had new uniforms, we had a retrofit coming down the pike that they knew they had to do. And these two were beautiful because we engaged them in the de facto process, but they knew the whole time that we had this new license agreement, and if we had to, we had the hammer. But we didn't want to use that, of course. So these were the two of the strongest things. But I would also say from a people standpoint, We had a marketing person in Patty Moore. And with the new dollars we got from the license renegotiation, we rebuilt several parts of our company, including our purchase and distribution. And we brought in then a guy named Drew Ritker. And Drew was fantastic on negotiating with these new requirements we had under the license agreement that everybody buy from the national contracts. Patty started driving same store sales with some new promotional activities because we required under that new license agreement, new deal, everybody had to be on the same menu. So, and by the way, this is so license renegotiation, strategic focus with the marketing and more broadly. And then a third element, a franchisee, and I say this in the book, 94, a franchisee came to me and said, you got to help me out. And he was a good operator. And I said, why? What's the problem? He said, I got a great program that's helping me. He said, things are healthy in Texas and Oklahoma, but they're not healthy in the Carolinas. And I got a great program that's keeping me alive. And your guys are telling me to shut it down. I said, well, tell me about the program. And so he proceeds to tell me about an ice cream program he's got. And I say to him, well, what does your top store do with this ice cream program? He said, well, my top store does 30% of its sales in ice cream. I said, you must be kidding me. I said, well, tell me more. I said, don't change anything. I'm going to send our marketing folks out there and you show them what we're doing, what you're doing. And so he did. And a year later, we rolled the thing out. We didn't shut him down. We rolled it out across the whole system. Now, so here what we have is new authority under the license agreement to require retrofits and this kind of stuff. And by 96, we have sales exploding, but more so profit exploding because we got this new frozen and fountain favorites menu. And so profits begin exploding 96 into 97. And we can require everybody to do the single promotions across the system. And we've now brought on this retrofit. And so once you get into, became CEO in 95. In 96, and 96, you start getting some benefit of Drew Ritker's purchasing. 97, the drinks and ice cream come into play. Average store profits from 96 to 97 jumped 40% for the operator. I'm not talking about the company. I'm talking about the average operator in what was then 12 or 1,400 stores. Jumps 40% in 1 year. These franchisees were suddenly just rolling in the dough. So what does this feed? It fed rapid rollout of a retrofit across the entire system. And what else did it feed? Rapid expansion of new stores. And we'd negotiated under the license agreement an ascending royalty rate. We said, okay, we got the old time royalty rate, but if we grow your sales, we want a higher royalty rate. And so we as a franchisor started getting disproportionately positive benefit from all this. And so, Anthony, when you talk about this run up, when I left the system, it began to push $5 billion in sales. But when I became CEO, it was about $800 million. In 1997, we hit for the first time ever $1 billion in system-wide sales, all stores, franchise included, $1 billion in 97. It had taken 44 years for the business to get $1 billion. 4 years later, we doubled it to $2 billion. This is the consequence of this kind of compounded same-store sales, new stores, et cetera. The business just exploded. And we had 97, we hit $1 billion. 01, we hit $2 billion. In 05, we hit $3 billion. So it was on a tear, you know. And as a result, so was the company. And we split our stock from 96 to 06. We split our stock, a 3-for-2 stock split. We split it 6 times in 10 years. And wow. it was just on a tear. It was a great run. It was fun.
Yeah. And obviously the success that you had not only gave you a bunch of experience and skills, but this book that you wrote, Master of None, I think the part to me that stuck out the most wasn't so much the individual stories or the experience or the skills. It was the mindset and almost like the philosophical take you have on business. And literally Master of None is kind of a counterintuitive type piece of advice where most people say, hey, you need to be an expert, right? You need to be an expert in the law to be the general counsel. You need to be an expert in finance to be the CFO, or you need to have an MBA and be an expert in business to run the actual business. You seem to have drastically benefited from actually being well-rounded and not having just one expertise, but kind of having a command of multiple disciplines. Talk a little bit about why that's been so important to you in your career and how that made you successful.
Well, the title of the book is Master of None. The subtitle is How a Jack of All Trades Can Still Reach the Top. So in some ways in this book, the subtitle is equally important to the title, if not even more so. But, this is that'd be an awfully long title to the book, How a Jack of All Trades Can Still Reach the Top. So it kind of turned it upside down. At any rate, has it been important to me? I'd say it has been all my life, because as growing up, I was active in formally in music in many ways, church music and school programs, music programs at school. But I was also active in sports, and I excelled in each. I was also a good student. Unfortunately, I was a good student often without trying hard. And I might have, really in all my endeavors, I might have benefited from somebody pushing me harder, but usually when somebody pushed, I walked away, So I was an avid reader, good student. In my book, I talk about really one of my first leadership positions, which would not be customary, I think, when you think about an executive with a public company. My first leadership position was president of the Boys Glee Club. When I was in junior high, I was in 8th grade. And that actually was the confidence that my teacher placed in me, really kind of helped my self-concept evolve in a positive way fairly quickly. That was a very nice thing at 13, 14 years old. What was my next run of leadership? It really was student government in my high school setting, in no small ways because the high school was undergoing a tremendous rapid change because of court-ordered desegregation. And so that was a huge growing experience for me. But I've always had a wide degree of interest. I enjoy, not unlike a lot of people, I enjoy food, enjoy travel. So I think coming into the business, I probably discounted my ability or my capacity to move into a leadership position because I didn't see it as leadership. I viewed it as business management. I didn't have business education. My undergraduate degree was in history. My graduate degree was in law. I did go into business law, granted, but it's the difference between business law and business school. Had no MBA, but what I didn't appreciate was that I had good education from a standpoint of critical thinking. In some ways, history and law are good counterparts to each other, because the history does let you go back and see, where events occurred and can be analyzed in such a ways to, draw conclusions or see different paths that might have occurred, historically had leaders done one thing or another. Law is an analytical piece of finding similarities or where other people don't see them, or finding distinctions where others think that the situations are identical. And the business law is a little bit different from trial work, but in many ways, the critical thinking that forces you through going through a legal education really makes that kind of separation and the critical thinking piece move to a very different level. So I think these really aided me when I got into business, because as opposed to not wanting to look back, some people don't, as opposed to not wanting to look back and do a postmortem on something you screwed up, my reaction is no, you must go back and look at what you screwed up to not repeat it. So it was a different approach, I think, to understanding the business and how you could manage it. I think I was always a generalist. I enjoyed, I played piano, but didn't take lessons. I played guitar, but I didn't take lessons, And so this was just kind of me, And so as I looked back over my career, I did rely on strong people. I had good teams. I delegated effectively, brought them resources, worked hard to keep things aligned in terms of objectives and activities. I say that because what I'm saying is functional behavior in an organization, keep the team aligned, and then make sure that adequate resources are placed in order to drive the specific direction. And so as I look back at my career, late in my career, and then thinking about the stories and, considering a book, did come to see myself as a business leader. Okay, I had to be a good manager here and there and throughout. But the main thing I saw was I was running a franchise organization, small independent operators of our concept who were very independent minded. And you had to find ways to sell them continuously on staying aligned. You couldn't just order them. You could, but that's a short-term gain. So I think over time I can look back and see that, kind of with that arc of history in my own life, enjoying a wide array of activities and not seeing that as an impediment to growing a company like Sonic. Instead, seeing as a foundation for a good leader, and seeing it as an empowering element of my own life rather than a limiting element, that jack of all trades.
Yeah, one of the things you talk about is kind of this like narrow focus is unsafe and boring. And so I think that that's like a really interesting framework, because the boring part is more a personal enjoyment, right? Of just who wants to be bored their whole life doing one thing.
Yeah. Right.
But the unsafe part, I think, is counterintuitive to people. So describe a little bit why you think of it as unsafe to have a narrow focus more rather than a more generalist or broad view of the business world.
Well, I think a lot of this depends upon the area you want to go into in life, because if you do decide you want to be a brain surgeon, then I think you better get pretty specific about what you're studying and what you're doing every day. On the other hand, if you decide you want to go into even something technical, let's just say in the technology world, you better approach it with some flexibility, because the pace of change there is so fast that if you are narrow with what you approach, even in the technology field, if you're narrow on what you approach, you could be irrelevant in 2 years, So from my standpoint, my view, kind of back up and get off the brain surgeon thing, or, at 12 years old, I thought I was going to be a cleanup batter for the Yankees, but by the time I was 15, I knew that wasn't going to be true, So what's my prep? And so from my standpoint, it was get a good education about how the world works. And as I said, also the critical thinking skills, and use these skills to be open to opportunities that come along, and ones that feel right for me, intuitively feel right, that I can embrace. But so in the book, yes, the discussion about being too narrow can do two things. One, the world can just bypass you. But the other thing is, to the extent you're too narrow, your head's down, focused, your head's not out, you're not keeping options open, opportunities can pass you by. And so my belief is, with being that generalist and keeping your head up and being open to new opportunities, you got to be able to see those opportunities to seize them. And I think it's the narrow person who thinks they can create their opportunities for themselves. I think most opportunities we don't create. What we do is prepare, and then the old adage that fortune favors the prepared, And so if you are prepared, it looks like you're lucky or whatever, but if you're prepared and your head's up and your eyes are open, you can seize opportunities that come along that you would never see otherwise. And I think the more narrow you are, more narrowly prepared, the more narrow in your work, the more likely you to have your head down, narrowly focused. You're going to miss opportunities. And there's also a better chance the world's just going to blow past you as your skills become irrelevant. So that's the gist of the book, I think, and at least that portion of it.
Yeah, and the part to me that seems so interesting is like this idea of exploration leads to breakthrough, right? Like you, if you just sit and do the same thing every day, it's very unlikely that you are going to have any major breakthrough, create any sort of significant inflection point. But that exploration, that intellectual curiosity, really kind of carries the day. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. A lot of it is intellectual curiosity. You got to be a curious person about how the world works and what may be about to occur, why it's going to occur, and how you're going to handle that. You're going to embrace it. You're going to avoid it. And so I think being curious and open, those two elements are two of the most critical elements of having a rich life, I think.
Yeah.
And
Well,
in your profession or personally, if you do the opposite, closed and not curious, you're going to have far less interesting business career, but also less interesting life.
for sure. Is there anything that you've done or anything that you can suggest to people in terms of how to increase intellectual curiosity, right? Like for you and I, who I think are generally or naturally intellectually curious people, we can just say, hey, be intellectually curious. But there's some people who just, that's not their inclination. Anything that you could think of that could help people become more curious or kind of at least get started down that path?
Well, it depends upon who you are, who I am that you're talking about. If you're talking about within an organization, as an example, very often, work to make sure that I was including a broad cross section of our team in all kinds of activities, so as to get a good functional behavior, a good integration of effort, and work as hard as possible, not to have silos. So this is, if I take your question to be, what could a person who's already leading an organization do to help the organization achieve what you're talking about? I mean, one of the things that I did is not so uncommon now, but 20 years ago it was. We were designing a new headquarters building, and the building is not what has to be new; it's the layout that is different. But I'd been by the time we were designing this, I'd been CEO of the company 6 or 7 years. We were in a high rise downtown, Main and Main. I had top floor, corner office, private bathroom, marble floors. You had to go through my secretary's space to get to me. And what I found was the longer that went on, the more horribly boring it was. I mean, the job of CEO is isolated. You're isolated enough and it's lonely enough as it is. If you make it physically isolated, physically lonely, it's even worse. So we were designing new space. I had picked up and visiting a couple other CEOs and their businesses, a different way to approach that. And I kind of pulled together combined elements of what I saw in these other places. So when we designed this new space, I designed it, first of all, so there's not a single corner office in the whole building. Every corner was a conference room. Secondly, went to modular furniture, so it wasn't about who got to fight over what size desk or what size chair. Everybody in the whole place had the same chair. I had the same chair as everybody else. And my floor was not in the corner, wasn't even on the top floor. I went to a middle floor, and I sat in the middle of the building. I had a desk out on an open floor using the same chair everybody else used. If I needed privacy, behind my open desk was a room that had a clear glass on all four sides. And so that if I needed, quote, privacy, I stepped into my glass room, and all the employees that were going by could see, business being conducted, et cetera. So my objective there was to blow up the silos and have the physicality of the office space work against building silos so that all employees could see each other every day. And it was an enormous contributor to just that. And so, but you can find processes as an executive leader, you can find processes to break down walls, to include people from other disciplines and key projects that you have, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, that's for the executive leader. For the individual, I think within an organization, an individual can, what you can do individually, of course, is just explore things through reading or or hobbies or otherwise to get into areas you're not naturally comfortable with. But within an organization, volunteer for task forces, even propose task forces that are cross-functional within the organization. Make sure you get into those task forces, that you meet other people in the company, that you engage in tasks that are beyond your department, beyond your comfort level to help you grow, et cetera. So it is a question of acting on your curiosity. It's one thing to have the curiosity. It's the other thing not to act on it. Because you don't act on it, then, okay, well, it's an academic point. So, but if you are a naturally curious person and you're in an organization that's run as silos and there's no way around it, well, you probably need to look for a new employer. But otherwise, I think you work to try to break down the silos, work cross-functional manner. And this, I think, can be really stimulating for a curious person.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear about that glass room that you had where you would kind of step in for privacy. When I worked at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg had one, and we called it the fishbowl or the aquarium, right? Because basically, kind of you feel a little bit like you're inside of that, and it was fascinating because somebody who's the executive of a large company can go in there for a phone call, can go in and meet somebody that nobody knows, or literally at one point the Prime Minister of India came and sat there, right? And everyone's walking by, and you kind of see the the business being conducted, as you mentioned. So it does have a very different effect than the CEO's office is up on the top floor, right? It's almost like the physical proximity can have an impact. When you think today for a young leader who aspires to kind of have the successful career that you've had, what is the advice if you were mentoring them? What are the things outside of what we've talked about already that you kind of just, hey, keep this in the back of your head, or these are the things that I wish I knew when I first got started that you would share with those young leaders?
Well, I depending on the organization, depending on what you're wanting to pursue, but you're describing it as an organizational leader. So by definition, this feels like a circumstance in which the generalist can benefit rather than the narrow specialist. So I think at a really younger age, the issue is get a good education and particularly in areas and on paths that do demand critical thinking skills and analytical skills. Beyond that, life is not target practice. Life's a journey. So don't try to aim at something that you think is going to enhance your path. Listen to your instincts. So in other words, your intuition, what sounds right to you, what feels right to you, and go on a path where things click for you, instead of trying to pursue something that you think from an external standpoint, on a resume or whatever, something that looks good, pursue something that feels right to you from your own intuition and your own talent and skill sets. And then beyond that, remain open to opportunity that comes along. Keep your head up, your eyes open, remain open to opportunity. One fellow that I talked to about my book, he endorsed the book, and I had him in my own podcast, Bill Fromm out of Kansas City, that has formed several companies in Kansas City that are headquartered in Kansas City, including those international scope. Bill makes the point, just say yes, which is the title of one of my chapters. Just say yes, because his comment is, when you say no, doors closed. Whereas if you say yes, and if you learn a month or two later, 6 months later, that you just really can't pursue this path, you can always go back to somebody and say, listen, I got to shoot straight with you. I thought we could do this, but I don't think we can do this. I thought I could cut this, but I think we need this additional talent, whatever. But the point is, learn how to say yes to opportunity and figure out how to do it. Because if you say yes, you're going to get full engagement. If you say no, you just close the door. So these are thoughts along the way to a person younger in their career. the other things that you would say are a little bit more obvious, and they're almost jingoistic, but they're true. And that is, you know, uh, work hard and do the job right, and make sure the job gets done well. But those are somewhat generic, but they're accurate, because if a person thinks that I got my college degree and now somebody owes me something, they're going to be a little surprised and a little disappointed, with that mindset.
One of my favorite business stories ever is the gentleman who ended up coming up with hot Cheetos. He was a janitor at the business before he came up with that idea, and he tells the story that he was working somewhere else and he gets the job as the janitor. And on his first day, as he's going to work, his grandfather says to him, "You make sure that everyone in that building knows Immunez, mop the floor." Right.
Yeah.
Just basically do your job, have pride in the work that you do. And
Right.
that's the advice he's getting, literally, to go mop the floors. And one day later, he ends up building, what ends up being a couple $100 million product line for Frito-Lay. And
Yes.
I think that there's a lot of people who say, "Oh, that's luck," or, that's this or that. And it's the same things that you took to work with you around hard work and pride in your work and things.
Right.
As a janitor, he's now applying to, something that people think is much more aspirational, right? But it's the
Yeah.
same exact qualities.
Yes. And he was also a guy who was within an organization where, he would keep his eyes open, because the CEO, I talk about that example in my own book, because the CEO invited that kind of input. He developed it at home, based on kind of some street food experiences that it had, and then called the CEO who took his call. Some organizations that wouldn't occur.
Well, it's like your ice cream story, right?
Yes, exactly. The people that were trying to shut down our franchisee on his ice cream were two of the most senior people in our company. And they told him the reason he wasn't going to do it was, just to say it. They told him, "That's too much like Dairy Queen, and we don't want to do it." And yet today, I've been gone from Sonic for 2 years, but my hunch is that at this point, Sonic has to be doing $600 or $700 million worth of ice cream. And
Wow.
at that time, as a system, we probably did 25 million.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just the increase in sales. My then CFO liked to say, anything. He said, "I love any promotion where it's something mixed with air or water." Because the product margins were just extraordinary. And that's how, with our frozen fountain favorites that we rolled out in 96, spring of 96 to 97, average store profits jumped 40%. Unbelievable, changed everything. But we did, back to your original question, we built on that. Everything that occurred, we used it to leverage something else. And the business just flat took off. Just a fascinating, just different way to look at the business over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's amazing. I wrap up each conversation with 3 questions. The first one is a little bit more serious, which is just, what is the most important book that you've ever read outside of obviously the one that you wrote?
One of the most, I could say maybe one of the most important books I've read outside of the one I wrote.
And just a book that sticks out in your mind as having had an impact on you.
Well, I remember as a kid reading a book that kind of showed that even a kid could branch out and do interesting and curious things and didn't need to be limited by age or circumstance. But I played baseball as a kid. I enjoyed baseball a lot. As a kid, I read a book, Dave Palmer's Diamond Mystery.
Okay.
A book about a young ball player, part sleuth. And it was a fascinating book that it was appropriate for my age, but it really kind of, one, it got me into enjoying reading all that much more. And 2, kind of set me on a path that, you can really be kind of quite aspirational. But in my adult life, I've mostly read biographies. And, in some ways, going back into my 20s, a series by Stephen Ambrose on Dwight Eisenhower was one of the more fascinating and delightful. sets of books I'd ever read. I think it was either a 2 or 3 book series. But Ambrose was a great author, and I have read quite a few pieces by him. But in some ways, I'd say the Eisenhower biography was one of the most enjoyable. And was watching his life growing up on the plains and eventually becoming president of the United States.
It's absolutely incredible. The second question is a little bit more fun. Sleep. So in 2020, I made a massive focus on, hey, I probably should sleep more. I was one of these people who was flying around, took 120 flights, literally, I think was sleeping kind of 4 or 5 hours a night. And I met the founder of 8 Sleep, and Matteo was like, "Hey man, you probably should sleep a little bit more." What is kind of your sleep routine as the CEO of Sonic, and then since you've left, is it something where you slept 8 hours every night? It just kind of got what you needed. How did you sleep?
I don't think I've ever slept 8 hours a night regularly, and I don't get more than 8 hours of sleep, but just a few times a year, and certainly not continuously. I'd say, so one thing I'd say is when I was just going into my teen years, 11, 12, 13 years old, I started delivering newspapers. And this meant getting up 3 a.m. every morning and delivering newspapers, go back to bed at 5 a.m. The number of nights now still where I wake up at 3 a.m., work for a couple hours and go back to bed at 5 a.m. is more often than I'd care to admit to. But this is a little bit of a pattern. I'd say in my years as being CEO that the most common deal was 5 to 6 hours a night sleep, maybe catching up a little bit on the weekend, but 5 to 6 hours a night. And I try to get more than that now, and I enjoy not having to rush off to work first thing, but or as it is these days, working from home anyway. But unfortunately, I still wake up at 3 a.m. I work for a couple hours, but I also now go back to sleep often for another 3 hours or so. So not uncommon for me to get 7 hours sleep now, but it's often
improving.
It's improving. I know the sleep experts would say, look, you need continuous sleep, but I can't do a whole lot about it. I wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm wide awake,
Yeah.
I don't fight it. I don't fight it anymore. I just get up and read or work on some projects and until I get sleepy, and I go back to bed. And usually it's 90 minutes or 2 hours of work. But I get a lot of work done in that 2 hours.
Nobody around to bother you.
Yeah. No phones ringing, no nothing.
Absolutely. I love it. The last question is a little quirky one. Aliens, are you a believer or a non-believer?
Well, it's my first thought to try to come up with some quip there, but as quickly as I do, I'll regret it. So I do think the universe is a fascinating thing, and it's hard for us to imagine, what all really is out there, because we are limited to our own reality to the greatest degree. And so we try to reinvent things, even to the extent we think about them being there, we reinvent them in our own likeness, So on the one hand, I have to say, it's a big universe, and the likelihood that this globe is the only one with life on it seems there's no reason to believe that has to be the case, and on the other hand, the more practical usage of aliens that we see in movies and other fearful sort of things, I have a hard time going there, but there are interesting things we all see and read periodically about things that appear in the heavens that lack any explanation. So who knows? I don't know. I'm not into the alien. I'm not into thinking about that or pursuing it, but nor do I totally discount it. So
yeah, I think that is the most rational way to view it. Is big world, probably life somewhere, but I doubt that they are the little green men that showed up in some movies. So I think you're more on it than you realize.
I just hope I hope if they come around, they're jacks of all trades. That's my hope.
I love it. Cliff, listen, thank you so much for your time. I've read through the book, Master of None, How a Jack of All Trade Can Still Reach the Top. And it is absolutely fantastic. And as I started off the conversation, it's just very obvious that you've done the work and frankly, just thank you for taking the time to write it all down and share the knowledge with folks. Cause I think, folks like yourself who have literally decades of experience building companies successfully, there's just so much information that you have that you can share with others. So highly recommend everyone go get it. And just thank you so much for taking the time to write the book and then have this conversation. Thank you, Anthony. As well.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate being on your program today, and I'm happy to be with you and happy to talk about one of the things I like to talk about. That is my business, my career, my book. So okay, take care.